Here. Mr. Majors,
Here.
Ms. Rolls,
Present.
Mr. Rodriguez, Ms. Bowers.
Present. Just like to note, Vice President Green is joining us via Zoom this evening. Okay, our policy work session this evening is to discuss short-term rentals. This is not a new discussion for the city, and it is not a new discussion for residents. But before we drafted any legislation pertaining to short-term rentals that are operating within the city of Harrisburg, we wanted to have a discussion about it. So this evening, we will begin with an introduction from our research analyst, Mr. Cedric Humphrey. We will then move to a practical guide presentation from Granicus that will be led by Mr. Jeffrey Goodman and Ms. Samantha White. And then we will conclude our discussion with the impact and considerations on behalf of the city administration. And then we will offer an opportunity for public comment. So our session will move this evening. So we will get started with our introduction from our research analyst, Mr. Cedric Humphrey.
Thank you, President Bowers. I've been asked to introduce the topic of short-term rentals for tonight's policy work session, and I will strive to be as concise as possible. It's been several years since the meteoric rise of home sharing short-term rental apps like Airbnb and VRBO. And while the industry took a hit during the COVID-19 pandemic, one thing is known for sure: it's clear that this industry is here to stay. There are many ideas for what makes up a short-term rental, and in order to avoid confusion, I'd like to define a short-term rental, or as it's often abbreviated, an STR, as a furnished residential property that is rented out for a period of time less than 31 days. Now, this is not an official definition by any means, or even a recommendation for language in any future legislation, but instead to illustrate a clear distinction from short-term rentals and other entities like short-term lease agreements or boarding houses. While the state hotel tax does apply to these rentals, currently there are no specific laws or regulations governing short-term rentals in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, leaving it up to local municipalities to set the local standards and regulations. Many municipalities have been quick to act, like the city of Easton and our neighbors to the south, the city of Lancaster. Now it may be our turn to regulate such rental properties if that is the desire of this administration and the council. A quick search online earlier today shows over 180 short-term rentals available in the city of Harrisburg at just this time alone on Airbnb. These range from an entire luxury home downtown with 6 bedrooms and sleeping capacity for 14 to private rooms and single-family homes scattered all throughout the city. There's estimated to be over 300 individual listings over the course of a 12-month period in the city, estimated to bring in $1.8 million over the same period for owners and operators. Currently, without a working codified ordinance, the city is powerless to address the potential issues facing the communities affected by the presence of short-term rentals. To name a few, short-term rentals being rented out as party houses, which brings on a whole subset of other issues, underage drinking, increased traffic in neighborhoods, and noise complaints, to name a few. Lack of local parking because of a multitude of vehicles for one short-term rental property. Decreased affordable housing options due to lower availability, and a drastic change in the ambiance and aesthetic of neighborhoods for long-term residents. While it would be nice, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the issues surrounding this topic, and whatever regulations would be in a final piece of legislation should be tailored for the specific needs of the city and empower the departments that are most affected to enforce these new rules. In October, I was asked to prepare a memo for the council outlining what other third-class cities in Pennsylvania, like Harrisburg, have included in their short-term rental ordinances, and my concluding recommendations were as follows. To explore an amendment to the zoning code that would allow for short-term rentals in specific designated residential districts, to explore a simple registration process that allows homeowners to pay a small fee in exchange for a license or something similar to that, to follow the city of Lancaster's lead and include a separation between homestays and short-term rentals, which would enable the city to create separate rules for owner-occupied short-term rentals. requiring owners to keep a record of rentees with specific contact information for each person or group in case of improper use or potential criminal activity, and to explore a density provision similar to the one enacted in the city of Easton, which establishes a minimum distance between short-term rental properties. This is just the beginning of the conversation. I just wanted to lay the groundwork for what will be discussed here the rest of the night. And thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now move to a practical guide presentation on behalf of Granicus. Mr. Jeffrey Goodman and Ms. Samantha White will lead us in the presentation.
Yeah, great. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. So my name is Jeffrey Goodman. I'm a urban planner by trade, and I've been working around the country on short-term rental regulations and enforcement systems for small local governments. You may hear in the background my intern, who is now asking for a snack. Excuse me 1 second. All right. So I have a presentation I can give. I think I can share my screen here. Or maybe I might need to be enabled to share my screen. I don't know. I think someone needs to give me participant screen sharing, or I can just describe it. It's up to you.
1 second, we're trying to.
No problem.
You should be able to share. You go ahead and.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. So I was asked to give a little bit of an introduction about how to get yourself into the right thinking about how to regulate short-term rentals. Short-term rentals are a very complicated issue for most communities because it impacts people's housing and their money, which means people often get very fired up about it. I live in New Orleans, where it is all everyone ever wants to talk about. It's a major issue here. I think we have close to 10,000 listings. But we talked to tons of communities, both Samantha and I, that even if they have only a handful of short-term rentals, the impacts on the community can be very important to solve for and very important to address through regulation. I think what we call a short-term rental, that is usually defined as under 31 days, because over 31 days, you get, in most jurisdictions, some sort of rental protection. But lots of places have different names for them, and there can be a lot of nuance to what an STR is and how to really focus on the things that are important for your community or for your context. The biggest thing I guess I can impress to you as you look at how to do short-term rental regulation is that you need a goal in mind. And where we often see communities struggle, I think, is they want to jump right into the weeds. They immediately want to get into the nuances of their ordinances or their proposed ordinances. And the question I always have for places is, what is success? How will you know in 1 year or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years that your regulation succeeded? And that can be a lot of different things. That can be, we increased our tourism tax. That could be, we don't get complaints anymore about parties. That could be, we protected housing availability or affordability. But it needs to be contextual, and it needs to be specific to your community's values and your community's long-term housing market and short-term housing market. How do you develop this kind of lens? So the first thing is you do need the view from the ground, right? I think oftentimes this issue is brought up because of a party house or because of a specific incident at a short-term rental, or because even you have hosts come in and say, we want to become legal. There's currently no framework for that. So you do need the view on the ground. How does it feel in the communities? Because that's where the rubber is going to meet the road. So certainly having a robust public input session or ability is going to give you that view of what is happening on particular properties. You do need a data. Often short-term rentals are easy villains, I suppose, that you can blame for housing issues, for noise issues, for any sort of issue. You need to be able to look at the data and say, this is the scope and scale of the impacts or of the problems or of the opportunities. Let's sort of verify some of our input we're getting from the community with that data. But also let's look at it within the realm of our general housing market. How is this going to affect housing availability or affordability? And as was mentioned, how does the internal sort of workings of the short-term rental market give you opportunities to be targeted with what you're doing, whether it's with home ownership, residency, the size of properties, the zones of properties. There's a lot of different ways to be able to cut up that market. And then the third thing is really about your vision as elected officials, as city staff. The average person on the street, they know what's around them, they know what affects them, but they don't always put it in the same terms as, how does this fit into the master plan? How does this going to fit into our zoning map? How are we going to enforce it? What's the budget going to be to enforce these things? What's the limit of state law in terms of what we can do in licensing or enforcement? So that's where your vision and your values can be applied to data, and be applied to community input to frame the debate in a way that's going to lead you into a real regulatory lens. As was mentioned, there's so many different ways that you can regulate to this issue. So I've listed 7 or 8 or 9. They're kind of infinite. And I think if you start to look at other jurisdictions, even surrounding you, there's a lot of variation. But it does allow you these types of specific issues to get at what's important to you, what's important to protect, or what's important to enhance, or what's important to tamp down on or limit in certain ways. But you need a lens in order to make the choices here. Otherwise, you're kind of grasping at straws. And I've seen a lot of ordinances where the first 10 ideas that people propose kind of become the ordinance. And those don't tend to be very successful. The ones that are successful have a rationale to defend. Why is it this and not that? Why is it here and not there? Why is it this size but not that size? Why is it this group of people but not that group of people? You're going to have to defend that. And having a lens or having an overarching goal will really help you say, this is why it's this is why it's that, this is why it's these things, when people push back against you. As was mentioned, you always should look at other ordinances. Something to keep in mind when you do look at them are what are these towns or cities' priorities? What were their budgets, right? You look at Santa Monica, California, they spend $3 million on this issue. You're probably not going to spend $3 million on this issue, and nor should you. What's the local housing market? What's your own political will? And what's the general context? So it's important to look at those factors when you read other ordinances to understand how to adapt those or tailor those to your goals. This is in New Orleans. This is not that far from my house. This is a sign that things are maybe a little out of control. I'll be joined by my intern here. One thing that comes up quite a bit are housing issues. In general, the professionalization of Airbnb and VRBO means that the people who tend to engage in this industry have, in general, more money and more experience doing property management. The old kind of mom and pop renting out a couch, that couch surfing era, I think is a little largely over. The gap between long-term and short-term rents does create pressure on renters and home buyers. That's been shown pretty thoroughly throughout the country, that as that gap widens, it's more attractive, I suppose, for homeowners to flip from long-term renting to short-term renting. Often that occurs in neighborhoods you wouldn't necessarily expect because of the price of housing, that it's easier to speculate in neighborhoods where the housing is relatively cheap than in the fanciest, the nicest neighborhoods where property is quite expensive. And in general about housing, it's always easier to protect units from being flipped to being short-term rentals than it is to try to roll that back. Once it becomes a short-term rental, and especially becomes a legal short-term rental, it's very, very difficult to make up the difference in income potential. And the concerns that we've seen across Pennsylvania, certainly in areas that are a little denser, issues about gentrification, a trend towards luxury housing, that is, you build something that is luxury. If you can't sell it, it becomes a short-term rental, which leaves out a lot of middle housing, workforce housing. In suburban and small town areas, we often hear about more quality of life concerns, although those are concerns everywhere. Or there may be certain types of groups that are more vulnerable to housing issues. And in rural areas, but even in fairly dense areas, we do see issues about workforce housing, limited housing availability, the absorption of new units into short-term rentals, and the difficulty of attracting residents in certain parts because they get displaced by short-term rentals. Something broad to think about in terms of enforcement, this has been very successful wherever it's been implemented, is to really separate out your types of violations. So minor violations, not that they're minor to the people who are involved, but minor in the sense that they are more subjective, I suppose, are quality of life violations. Noise, trash, parking, even some safety issues. Those are things that are about operations. They are things that often communities give hosts the ability to try to correct. They also tend to be a little bit more subjective, and they're more expensive to deal with because they require proof that comes maybe from a police officer or from a code enforcement agent, someone on the ground. Major violations, on the other hand, which are more about licensing, those are often more effective about dealing with issues. So those would be operating without a license, operating outside the scope of the license, failure to pay taxes, fraud in terms of home ownership or residency. Those things are not 3 strikes and you're out. The places that have success tend to say, you do it or you don't, right? Either you have a license or you don't. Either you paid your taxes or you don't. And they tend to really focus on that as a way to drive compliance, especially if you're moving from unregulated to regulated. Really focusing on that to ensure that everyone who's participating in the industry is someone who signed up for the values embodied by your ordinance, but is acting in a professional way, is acting in a way that is going to be more respectful to their neighbors, is going to check their property more and all those things. If they're not willing to get a license, it does filter down into those quality of life concerns. Some other emerging issues that I wanted to mention, tax collection is a big issue. Failure to pay taxes is a constant problem. Often states have, or even local governments have, deals with the platforms to collect taxes. That system is not currently able to be audited, so you don't actually know if you're getting the right amount of money. Assessment is an interesting one in terms of short-term rentals being assessed either as the same or different values as residential or commercial property, and making that decision by the assessor can really affect the impacts on housing in those neighborhoods, because short-term rentals often are comps to other types of housing assessments in the neighborhoods. And then something that has come up is, if you have any, and I'm in Philadelphia later this week for the American Planning Association, water quality issues, if anyone's using well water or on septic, making sure that those systems can handle a short-term rental use and are not degrading water systems or infrastructure is very important. So these are things that honestly most communities didn't even talk about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago in terms of short-term rentals, but is now becoming a much bigger issue across Pennsylvania. So I guess to sum up, the real common mistakes that we see are not having a planning lens, not having a goal in mind, not knowing what you're trying to solve for in your ordinance is the number one issue. If you don't know what you're solving for, it's hard to make the choices that you need to make in order to kind of define this issue in a way that's going to work. I would say also a problem that we run into is not treating lodging holistically, which is to say, there's a continuum of lodging from a person who rents out their couch one day a year to a resort. How are you drawing those lines to separate out things that are important to you? Often that's about whether it's residential or commercial, whether it's assessed as a commercial property, whether it has impacts on neighborhoods or housing. So you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If you have a bed and breakfast ordinance or similar ordinances, how do you make sure that that category isn't invalidated by a short-term rental ordinance, but the short-term rental ordinance enhances it? And then broader about communicating expectations. You know, we've run into tons of places where people think that if we solve short-term rentals, every possible thing will be solved in their community, that, you know, their missing cat will be found, that all these things will be locked up, and it's just not, it's not always the case. So you do need to make sure that you're communicating expectations about what is the scope and scale of the problem, and what is the scope and scale of the solution or opportunity to that. And that can help keep temperatures at a nice lower level instead of immediately everyone running to get their pitchforks and torches. So those are, I think, the biggest mistakes and the biggest things that you can look for as you go throughout this process. So that was it. That was my brief presentation. Thank you. And thank you to my beautiful intern.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for sharing. Samantha, did you have anything to add?
I think just opening it up to any questions that you guys have for us, and anything else that we can field. Yeah, basically the insight that I have is more around some of the data and analysis. So really just opening it up to anything else that you would want to sort of delve into at this point.
Okay, are you available to stay on as we talk about the impact and considerations from the city administration lens?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you. I will now move to the impact and considerations on behalf of the city administration. I believe Mr. Jeffrey Knight is here and Mr. Mike Hughes on behalf of the administration. We are having an issue with our Zoom account, so you will receive a new link and you will have to rejoin. We will resume momentarily, just making sure all of our virtual participants.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay, thank you everyone for your patience and for rejoining the meeting. I think we can begin our conversation with the city administration. I'm not sure who would like to begin.
No one.
Okay, well,
I'll start.
somebody. Thank you.
No problem. Denise Hill, Director of Housing and Economic Development. So just wanted to add from the perspective of the Housing Department, where we are, what we see, and what we would need out of this discussion and further discussions that are had surrounding short-term rentals. Just wanted to basically state that there is a huge demand for efficiency, short-term rentals. I personally, my staff and I, we don't see a lot for Airbnb, but that is just by nature of what we deal with in our office. And that is due to the high increasing cost of rent. So with there not being legislation specifically around caps on rent, then there comes a need for individuals who are in need of affordable housing, efficiencies, 1-bedrooms, sometimes furnished. It's not so much as on the tourism side, but for basic housing needs. What I see is that there is a great need for policy and regulation on rent prices to lower that demand for boarding and rooming houses. So those two could work hand in hand. If it is the decision of this body not to sanction short-term rentals, there would need to be conversation and some work around what do we do with rent prices, because individuals are not able to afford the rent prices that we are seeing. And that's not isolated to the city. 3 major things that would be needed are enforcement/safety, staffing for that enforcement, and then policy, which is defined and enforceable. So 2 last things that I just wanted to mention, how we find out in DDHD, how we find out about rooming houses are 2 main ways. One is a fire, and then the fire department then goes in and realizes the structure of the inside of the home is very different than what it appears on the outside. And then there's a jilted tenant is the second one. So someone has been locked out of a unit and then they come down to codes and they complain. But otherwise, a lot of times if we don't have reason to go in, and I mean, we as the city, sometimes we do not know and we can't get a hand around exactly how many are in the city. And then lastly, I do talk to landlords who want to do right and want to help with the housing stock and the housing issues that we do see in the city. But they don't feel that they have any recourse. So if they're not able to rent out a property as a short-term rental, they don't know how they are able to help. So a lot of times I'm referring to other organizations so that they are working directly with housing and homelessness prevention organizations as some type of remedy, because they have a housing stock and a desire to help, but they're not able to rent directly to multiple people. So sometimes connecting them to the individuals who have the need is the best that we can do. And on the flip side of that, I am not talking to the landlords that know that short-term rentals are not sanctioned in the city, and they're setting them up and it is occurring in the city, but they are not the ones coming into my office asking how they can help. So figuring out a way that we are able to get our hands around this and really enforce and do it the right way is the huge need that I see from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like to go next?
Bruce Henry, I'm the Deputy Codes Administrator.
Can you please speak into the microphone and make sure it's turned on, just so everybody can hear you? Thank you.
Deputy Codes Administrator. And most of the,
I don't think
It's
the
on?
microphone is on. Sorry, Bruce.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's on.
okay, you just have to speak literally
Yeah,
right into it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm Bruce Henry, I'm Deputy Codes Administrator. Most of the items that we see have already been mentioned in the presentation. And, on a lot of the items also. Biggest complaints we get are, the noise that they create, lack of on-street parking that they take up, the increased traffic in their neighborhood. And the codes perspective, a lot of times what the owner does to the building conflicts with the building codes by either by the building code itself or by definitions. So our biggest focus here is are they following the building codes and public safety? Because if somebody's visiting here, they're staying in something that's not familiar to them, and it's not an owner occupied unit. There's no sprinklers, there's no egress lighting, there's no exit lighting, and your memory is going to be from what you're used to at home. And now you're in a strange place, and hopefully nothing happens, but in that moment of panic, you're going to know how to get out of that building. So that's where the code comes in to help out public safety.
Thank you very much.
Mike Hughes, tax administrator, business licensing also. From our perspective, well, first off, we started down this road about 2016, 2017, initially on this, had public hearings back then. So we haven't addressed it as a city. In our office, and I know Jeff's office and a couple others, we've continued to receive phone calls and letters and inquiries, about this subject, over the last 10 years. And it's still happening today. We hear from neighbors. We actually hear from some of the Airbnb people that want to become licensed. And then we hear from real estate speculators from out of town contacting us, trying to find out what, if any, rules and regulations do we have before they want to invest here. So those are kind of the three areas that we generally hear from. Haven't really been able to give people a good answer because we don't have anything in place at the moment. And speaking to that, we currently, with my office, license and or regulate pretty much all other segments related to this, from landlords, bed and breakfast, hotels, motels, and rooming houses. So this was one area that kind of falls in that gray area or unregulated area. So we haven't had a real answer to give people in that respect. We did listen to the public at our last meeting. We also had representatives here from the bed and breakfast industry, from the hotel, motel, restaurant, all those associations. And a lot of neighbors did come out. The room was packed. So we did get all sides at that point. And, we had come up with some suggestions, but nothing ever came forward at that point. So, but once again, our office, we do see this as a segment that is currently gray, unregulated. Kind of has caused us some issues with other people that we are regulating. If we were to regulate it, based on the expected volume, as far as my office goes, we could easily assimilate it. We already have the staff in place and a process if we would go that way. So I don't see a problem there from my office's standpoint. Initially, we could also use a service. There's Granicus, there's other services out there. Companies that actually can find all those units for you initially. And then, you know, possibly you could use the service or you could take it from there and do, you know, ongoing potential licensing and staying on top of all the new ones as they come into play. Some of the platforms will work with you and forward taxes if that's what's going to happen. Otherwise, our office would be tasked with collecting those, but like I said, we're already doing that for most of those other segments, so it wouldn't be a big lift from my office's standpoint. I think Cedric and Granicus did do a really good job laying out all the, you know, potential issues to begin with. There are some more in detail, but I don't know that it makes sense to get into those at this point until we have an idea of which direction we're going, you know, whether it's a total ban or total open market or somewhere in between. When we get more guidance on which way we should be heading, we can bring forth much more information and guidance from these offices once we know the direction we want to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Knight, Planning Director. I'd say that my department, with respect to this topic, kind of falls into kind of the middle of the Venn diagram of both the three speakers to my left here, both the housing policy and what the downstream implications of our regulatory structure that we create are, the physical structures themselves, how people get in and out of the building, what they look like, how many units there are. And then also the permitting process here that Mike was kind of discussing. And I would, echo a lot of the comments that we heard, both from city staff and the folks at Granicus, in regards to the types of issues that are involved, and the type of potential impacts that this type of industry can have on the city. A lot of times, I think I'm probably the first point of contact for a lot of people asking about short-term rentals, especially, to Mike's point, if you're an out of the city or out of state investor looking to set up properties. I get those questions all the time. Asking what are our regulations? Do we have any? Where can I do this? And so, we've tried to manage the issue as best we can, considering the lack of kind of really defined regulatory language for something like this. And I do kind of want to make a note that we do need to make sure we're clearly defining this, because I noticed there was some talk about boarding houses and rooming houses earlier, and we actually do have very specific language in the zoning code for those things. Like those might fall under a general term of short-term rental, but rooming houses have been around a lot longer than something like Airbnb or Vrbo or these short-term rentals have. I mean, they go back to what, 30s, 40s, 50s. We used to really not regulate them at all. And when the current zoning code was adopted in 2014, we put a lot more strict regulations and restrictions on those types of uses, requiring them to be owner occupied, ADA accessible, things of that nature. And to my knowledge, in the almost 10 years we've now had the current code, we haven't had a single application come through the process to formally establish a rooming house. And so we do have a set of regulations for things like rooming houses. What we don't have is for like kind of the short-term rental Airbnb. And I think those are different. A lot of times those are different populations that they're serving. The short-term rental kind of, I think to some of Denise's testimony is, somebody that is not, maybe has week-to-week work or something, or is not able to have the resources and the money to pay a full month ahead of time, or much less like a deposit, for those kinds of things. And so they usually end up in a short-term rental scenario where you're usually renting like week to week, where you've got a bedroom and then you're sharing a bathroom and maybe kitchen facilities. And so, I think we really need to make sure we're kind of defining what we're talking about here. I think that's one of the big issues, is defining that, because short-term rentals do kind of sit, again, in the middle of that Venn diagram of rooming houses, accessory dwelling units, and bed and breakfasts. They all kind of share characteristics with all three of those things, but they're definitely different. And so, defining exactly what we're talking about, and then kind of to Mike's point is defining exactly what the city wants. It could be total ban, wide open, or somewhere in the middle. And then one more step going beyond that is enforcement, because, whether we have regulations or not, just like we have with rooming houses, we're going to get people setting these up. And so when that happens, and if they're operating outside of whatever regulations we set up, what are our recourses then? What do we have the staff to go after people? Is the do we have a process laid out? Is the process kind of punitive enough to discourage people from, doing that outside of our regulations? And I think those are kind of the three real big issues that city council and the administration kind of need to confirm before we kind of start putting pen to paper on what the regulations look like.
Thank you. Let's see, before we move to questions from my colleagues, I think we're going to lose access to the Zoom again in probably a little under 10 minutes. I do have another link where it would be extended. I guess I can. Okay. 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 I know. Thank you very much, everyone. We shouldn't have any other technical difficulties. Okay. So guess I'll begin the line of questioning before we open the floor for public comment. Ms. White, you mentioned that your realm is related more toward the data collection. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the data that you recommend we collect.
Oh, sorry. I couldn't hear my name. Yeah, I can speak to the data. I'll just share my screen and we can click off from there.
Okay, do you have access to share? I didn't put any permissions on it. Uh-oh, okay, hold on.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to do is basically take you through some of the analysis that we have for the short-term rental market itself. And basically, it's a snapshot that we did in March of 2023. So basically, what we're doing is we're pulling down the data from the top 70 plus short-term rental platforms, and then matching that with assessor data when we go through the short-term rental identification process. But in terms of what we actually found, we identified 380 short-term rental listings, which represents 256 unique rental units. So the difference between a unique rental unit and a listing number, the unique rental unit is the actual physical property. So say 123 Main Street, each one of those physical properties has the ability to list on more than one site. And that's the reason why the listing number is higher. So you can see up in the top left-hand corner, basically what we're doing is rolling up the short-term rental platforms based around their parent companies themselves. So the one thing that you really can see from the map here is that you guys have a spread across all of the different short-term rental platforms. So wrapped up in TripAdvisor owned, Priceline owned, Airbnb. So there is basically just a good spread across each one of the platforms. Other information that really does look at shaping some of your short-term rental regulations, median nightly rental rate, so about $105 per night that's being charged. In terms of looking at permitting fees, I know that that was something that was touched upon earlier on. One of the things that we know is that the national average for short-term rental permits is about $250 per annum. Basically, what we look at is 2 to 3 times the median nightly rental rate. So basically, you have anywhere from about $200 up to $300 is where you would see your permitting fees sort of sit. And that would basically look at sort of the cost of doing business, making sure that the program does cover itself and that it is able to put money back into the community that really does level the playing field around, what we're seeing and sort of the dynamics of how the short-term rentals are impacting the community. Other analysis that we have looks at the sort of breakdown around unit types. So mainly entire homes that are being rented out, but a split between multifamily homes as well as single family homes. So basically, we'd say a 55-45 split between single family homes and multifamily dwellings. So the last bit that I really want to take you through is just looking at sort of the growth in your market, because it is relatively substantial. So year on year, what we're seeing is about 40% listing growth. So basically what we're seeing is that the number of platforms that are actually being used within the short-term rental market is growing. So what this generally speaks to is people are becoming a little bit more well-versed. They're not necessarily just using an Airbnb to market their property. They're using the other platforms as well. And it does speak to the fact that, that when they start using other platforms, they are more seasoned short-term rental owners. The other thing that we are seeing is that about 33% year-on-year rental unit growth. So a good amount of rental unit growth. When we look back at the short-term rentals in your market, because you are at 256, it is March of 2023, so kind of not in your peak season, which we would anticipate to be in the warmer months. What we would see is at about 30% year on year. By the time you get to next year, you are going to be in that 300 range. So just really keeping that in mind, because you do have a good or a high rate of growth at the moment as well.
Thank you very much. Okay. I really wanted to hone in on the data, since that seems to be something that might have been missing from our initial research. I understand and agree with the need to clearly define the short-term rental. That was something in my preliminary research that I found helpful in not only defining the short-term rental, but in some instances, other cities defined a long-term rental, which we know would be the longer than 31 days. They also defined an operator, which I thought was interesting. And Seattle actually defined a platform as well. Ms. White, you mentioned the varied platforms. I think the most popular one is Airbnb, but there are others that operate in the space. I know we briefly talked about a registration process or form. Is that something that either the city administration could speak to, the possibility of some form of registration, or Granicus representatives, do you have any insight on the impact of a registration or application?
If you're talking about, can it occur? Yes, it can
Yes.
occur. It have to be in an ordinance. The ordinance would probably also authorize whichever office is doing it. For example, if it's tax and enforcement, that they could create regulations and forms to go with it, just like they do for other things that they do, and how they have become available to the public. So it really depends on what the details of an ordinance would be. But sure, we can have a registration. If you recall, we have a foreclosure registry, and we use a third-party vendor to keep that for us, essentially.
Thank you. I'm going to open the floor to any questions that my colleagues may have, either for the members of the city administration or for our two Granicus representatives. I will begin with our Building and Housing Committee Chair, Councilman Majors. Any questions?
Excuse me, and thank you, to our research analyst, Cedric, for putting together a lot of the information here. As was noted, we have initial discussions occurred a while ago, but I think the temperature at the time from the administration was not to really embark upon that opportunity. So I'm glad we're having another opportunity to have this discussion. One of the things, pointed out was, and I'm glad the research on the third-class cities is here, because one of the things that a question that I had received that we had talked about, Cedric, was, the ability to deal with a number of issues, I know, but because of how Pennsylvania hasn't really looked to address this, holistically, and I know there may be some movement in the General Assembly to tackle this. Seeing what other third-class cities have done is helpful, and as we're looking to move forward with this. So one of the things I looked at when we're looking at what Lancaster did was the zoning. So for Jeff, if we are gonna look to do something like this, would you look to ensure that certain zones within this, zones could participate, or would any zones be excluded? Is that something that we should look to consider as we're, looking for, particularly like a lot of our central business districts? We do hear a lot of complaints from residents in Shipoke about conversions. So is that something that I know, like Lancaster explored, is going down that road and has defined it for homestays and short-term rentals? That's something we should look to do if we're gonna participate and go down this road.
Yeah, I think there's probably three ways of looking at that. We can do it, maybe geographically, where it would be limited or largely confined to like the downtown area. It could be by zoning district, similar to any other use, like a bed and breakfast or something, where it'd be permitted by special exception or not permitted at all, in which case it would require variance. Or it could be something of a, owner occupant kind of deal. And that would be, separate from those other two things, where whether you're an owner occupant in the downtown center or the residential medium density district, you'd be able to do it. So I think those are kind of the three approaches you would look at in terms of, maybe how you're approving this, or where you'd prefer to limit the types of the locations of this use. About 70% of the city, I think, is in the RM district. So, that's something you'd want to consider, and that's pretty much in every neighborhood in the city. So if that's something where we felt maybe that would give you a little bit too much latitude, then you'd probably put that as a special exception or a variance for that particular district.
Okay. One of the other questions I had, and I'm just trying to make sure I'm framing this correctly. One of the other issues that I think we do have is with some of our landlord tenant issues, particularly around absentee landlords, is being able to have someone to contact. I know there's discussions about having a contact person, and I know some of the research that Council President Bowers had done in the past, and some of the things that have been provided to us by other residents had to do with ensuring that if we are going to go down this road, not only is there someone, or if it's owner occupied, that's one provision, but having someone residing in the city who can be a contact person for property maintenance. And some of our other ordinances, we have people have to live within a certain vicinity to be able to respond, hopefully relatively quickly in instances. But I think, given the nature of this, particularly with the affordable housing crisis we have in the city, this is just, I guess, just me thinking out loud, is trying to ensure that we have that local component dialed in pretty good for these short-term rentals. Lastly, looking at City of Philadelphia and a few other communities, to our codes administrator's point, I guess we could potentially also look to explore ensuring that, since we are to have to do inspections, that any unit is up to the most up-to-date PA code. Is that something that we would do or look to do in an ordinance? Building code, excuse me.
Yeah, that'd be correct. Want to make sure that they're following the code when they're renovating the building to be that way. And be an annual inspection, make sure they're maintaining the property similar to the rental registration program for other rental properties.
Okay. President, I may have some additional questions, but let my other colleagues go. Thank you, President Bowers.
Thank you. I just had a follow-up question regarding public safety. I know that was mentioned, and I believe during previous conversations, Chief Enterline wanted to ensure that the location that was operating as a short-term rental had smoke detectors and other carbon monoxide detectors as well. Is that something that you all are aware of, or is it still a part of the conversation?
Now, we're aware of that.
Okay.
It's also part of the building code.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, Councilman Lawson, do you have any questions?
Certainly, yes, thank you. So, and I'm not sure exactly who I may send this to. This may just go with licensing and like that. So we talked about registration fees that we could impose. But the other question I have is, in something like this with a short-term rental, are we able to collect such as like a hotel tax or something of that nature?
They should already be paid the hotel tax if they're operating those.
Right.
Well, and without the definition, and they really are kind of tricky. If you stay in a facility longer than 31 days, I believe is the number in Pennsylvania, you no longer have to pay the hotel tax. You can get a refund of that from the hotel. And that's already allowed in Pennsylvania hotels. And some of the folks that we've had, I think, closer to the boarding house kind of things, have really walked that line where they claim the privileges of being, for example, an innkeeper, but don't pay any hotel taxes because they keep the people there so long. So, and so they don't, and if they collect them, who knows, but they certainly don't remit them. And they don't remit them to us, they remit them to the Dauphin County is where they get remitted. So it's a tricky, you know, people in business, if they're smart, they figure out ways to sort of avoid, if they can, a tax that's out there. And that's sort of a recurring issue. So.
Thank you. That's the question that I had.
I know a little bit about this due to my full-time job, but technically they should be registered like a hotel or a bed and breakfast inn, and the money would funnel from the state directly to Dauphin County, and then it would funnel to the city of Harrisburg.
And then the next, I guess that follow-up question would be, and I think you sort of alluded to this, if they are operating as a short-term rental, they should be, if they're working through one of the companies, they should be registered essentially as a hotel of some sort.
I would say that I don't have an answer to that. Right.
It's not, no.
Right.
Okay,
It's still sort of open.
okay. That's why I was
Um,
asking the question, because I thought that may be one reason why many people decide to go into that vein so they can avoid.
Mhm.
So,
Thank
so
you.
as the presenter talked about, some of the states have trouble auditing the returns that come in, for example, Airbnb, because they don't really have the data behind it to say, is that the right amount that they collected in revenue? So I can figure out if it's the right amount of taxes. And that has been an ongoing debate all over the place. And there has not been statewide legislation to solve that problem. So until there is, I don't think we're gonna have an enforceable provision that Department of Revenue can really hammer them with for disclosures.
Okay,
I
thank
just
you.
want to say really quickly, it's my understanding that if you're registering on Airbnb or VRBO, the website collects the tax and then remits it to the state of Pennsylvania. So the owners and operators are not involved in the tax process if you're listing online.
Okay, so if they were self-listing, just like putting their stuff on, I don't know, like a Facebook marketplace or something like that, then they may be skirting, but if they're doing it legitimately, then well, the tax should be taken.
Yes.
Airbnb did have an opt-out. I don't know if they still do. So you could opt out to self-report, but
Right.
I just don't know whether they changed that or not.
I don't think that they have, but there's no regulation for Airbnbs. There was legislation circulating the past 2 legislative sessions for operators to simply register with the Department of Revenue. They would just have to note like their name, that they're operating their business under, their address, and any contact information. However, the Department of Revenue is opposed to the registration process outlined.
And then I guess the question for codes and are you receiving a lot of complaints from people who are actively operating Airbnbs, not so much the rooming houses, but the as we're determining short-term rentals?
Complaints about the Airbnbs or? complaints from-
Really complaints about either whether it be condition, whether it be quality of life issues. Are we getting a lot of that now, or are we just forecasting that it may be coming based
No,
on our growth?
We're getting it now.
And I guess just for clarification, is it from, to Councilman Lawson's point, is it from the owner operator or is it from residents that are in the vicinity?
It's from residents in the vicinity.
Yeah, that's, like I said, I know, speaking as a person who's been on council for the last 8 years, definitely heard from several residents over that time about Airbnbs in their neighborhoods and a lot of the issues that came up, as Cedric pointed out, and Council President Bowers has noted as well. So that's why we're looking to have these conversations. Yeah, I don't think to the point of President Bowers, I think the issue isn't necessarily with the owner operators, because it's going to be a very difficult thing to calculate the revenue, right? If I'm owning and operating this as a business, if no matter what Airbnb or whoever the entity is that is I'm using as a platform to showcase and potentially get an occupant to reside there, what I use the money for, I receive in revenue. How do you calculate that, right? Outside of whatever the tax, quote unquote, is that Airbnb charges and whatever fees, if I'm using that to pay off the property, I'm not necessarily reporting all of the revenue that's coming in to me from that property. So I could be renting it at, name your price, especially surge pricing in the summertime, making a huge profit, paying for the mortgage. And yeah, so it becomes a very difficult thing that hopefully, might be able to enlighten us a little bit on some of those issues.
Right.
Sure
If
is.
we were to mirror process similar to our business license, business tax, first of all, they should be reporting that on their personal tax return to the IRS on a schedule, whether it's a Schedule E or Schedule C, and they should be claiming 100% there. So, but if we follow a similar process to what we currently do with businesses, we would require them to submit a copy of that federal schedule to verify that all the receipts are being claimed and that revenue coming to the city.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Councilman Lawson?
That's everything. Thank you. I think you actually got to the point that I wanted to figure out is how do we capture the revenue to help benefit the city?
As long as the individuals are reporting it properly to the IRS, they will report it properly to us.
Thank you.
I will say, sorry, I was going to interject. The one question is just making sure that the information is clear to people, because one of the things that we do find is when you have a short-term rental regulations and you have sort of different communities, some places that are collecting, such as Airbnb, and then other platforms that are not, people don't necessarily recognize or know that they are supposed to be paying or remitting this tax directly to the county. And so a lot of the times what will happen is they will just fall out. So that's what Jeffrey was alluding to earlier on. And it's one of the reasons why we do work across both county as well as constituent municipalities, because we do know that quite a lot of the times that will just fall out. People aren't remitting the tax. They don't actually know that they're supposed to be remitting the tax straight to either the county or the constituent municipalities. And so there needs to be a mechanism in place in order to drive that tax collection, especially if it is important to you, to make sure that you do have a mechanism in place in order to drive that. And in a lot of municipalities that we work with, we will work across both the county as well as the constituent municipalities in order to make sure that they are driving that tax revenue through. So we do see that work quite nicely in New York State, particularly where they do have both county as well as constituent municipality agreements and shared services agreements. So that way they are working cross purposes. So it is something that definitely can be explored quite a bit further.
Thank you. Councilwoman Rawls, any questions?
Thank you, President Bowers, and good evening to everybody on Zoom present with us. I just have two questions, but one just came about, well, actually three questions. But one just came about with what Ms. White just said. So with the tax collection, can that be part of the ordinance, or is it a separate, or anybody else? Would that be within the ordinance so people would know they need to remit that tax, or is it a separate piece of information?
It can be in an ordinance.
It can be.
You know, and it can cross-reference other parts of the city code in the ordinance, you know, just saying section, whatever applies whenever you have a short-term rental under this chapter. So,
Okay, and then will we need to set up a system to say, because I guess Mr. Hughes, you would collect it, but would there be something separate that needs to be set up to say, this is what you need in order to do it, or is it an easy rollover?
Kind of like I said earlier, we already have, you know, the systems in place that we could easily absorb it in my office.
Thank you. One of my other questions, I think you may be able to answer this, Ms. Hill. You had mentioned lowering rent prices, which I know is an issue within the city, and that sometimes, I guess, because rent prices are so high, a lot of people are going to these rooming houses where the rent is much lower. Are we able as a city to regulate rental prices? I don't think so, but I don't know what I'm missing. Just more information for me, because if we can, I think we would all love a way to try to regulate those rent prices for our residents.
Yeah, so that's the sticky part. There's without legal guidance of saying, yes, we can, I don't believe, because again, there's nothing at the state level, national level, we're seeing it all across. And the rooming house and the boarding houses are seemingly cheaper on the front end. But when you calculate it over a month's time, a lot of times you're paying way more than what you would be. But it's vulnerable populations that can't afford a credit check. They don't have long employment history. So they are ripe for getting something very quick, something short term. So that's what they are more used for. So it's not always the most cost effective. Most times it's not, but it's the
It's
easiest.
quicker. Yeah,
Yes.
it's easier.
It's a lower barrier to get access to some type of housing.
Okay. And we would be correct, Mr. Grover, that we can't regulate any rental prices.
I would say that that's worth looking at a little bit more. It has not been successfully done, except perhaps in Philadelphia. I'm not sure that was successful. I believe Pittsburgh took a shot at it. They're also a different classification, both of those in our city. Philly has the most independence in the state in terms of passing rules. But rental regulation is a very big lift. It implicates at least 3 different federal constitutional principles. And so, I'm not saying I've concluded it's impossible. I'm saying it would be a very big lift to find how to thread that needle, and we would be out in front of the curve by a lot.
Yeah, and I'll just note, that was actually another question that Mr. Humphrey did some research on. As the solicitor noted, there's nothing explicitly prohibiting us, but there's nothing giving us that authority as well.
Right.
There has been legislation introduced at the state level to do both, to explicitly say that communities cannot establish rental caps, and then would allow communities to be able to establish caps outside of what's already federally established through federal housing vouchers and those types of affordable housing that the feds do. So both pieces on either side have been introduced, but I do not even recall, and they have not gotten past the committee level, so they may not even have an opportunity to really have a full discussion fleshed out. So that is one of the other concerns that I know a lot of us share here. Even we're going to explore looking at this, which I think, given what we're doing here and past present, that we're going to look going down that road, but how do we address this along with the affordable housing crisis that we're experiencing in our city and nationally. So trying to figure out how all those pieces go together is, as Mr. Grover noted, is going to be a difficult needle to thread.
Yeah. Thank you. And my last question was, do we have currently enough data when drafting this type of ordinance to see what, just so we know what kind of policy we need to draft, what that ordinance looks like? Do we have enough data that says, here are the things the residents want, here are the things long-term or short-term rental owners want too, just to find a happy medium? Do we have enough data on that at all? I don't know who can answer that. And if we don't, how do we go about?
Yeah, as far as I know, we do not have what I would call data. We have anecdotal
No.
evidence from the calls that come in,
Okay,
from emails. I guess someone could be tasked with trying to go to the various departments and put that into some kind of
yeah,
form of data, and whether they're the same people calling each department, I don't know.
right, so that's the thing,
You know,
right,
but I wouldn't suspect there'd be lots of data we could get that was reliable based on complaint calls.
okay,
I'm not sure the people doing Airbnb for the most part are calling us,
right,
right? There are some very vigorous points of view from them, at least some of them, on what we should and should not do.
right.
One of the things, if council and the mayor are looking to do this, I think to take into consideration is that, at least from a zoning change under zoning law,
Mhm.
the people that are already here are a non-conforming use if we create a restriction or prohibition for them. So that doesn't knock them out of the box. You know, is there something else? I mean, and I think part of this is registration fees, part of this is inspections. I think you'd have to look at it comprehensively to see what fees apply and what do not, because it could have its own unique fee set. It could have a combination, for example, its own business privilege / affordable housing license. And if it was, for example, as was suggested, it could be $250. That would be much more than our normal business license. But, you know, making it, adding to it, slicing it, still, they already required, frankly, to file a business tax return for any revenue in a business in the city. I would guarantee most of them are not doing that. You know, what we could have the effect, if the council did not want this to expand, as Jeffrey was pointing out, there's ways to put things in. That effect that it had on registered boarding houses. Now, to me, it doesn't really matter that they're not applying because they're still here. They keep coming. We say you can't be here, so all they say is I don't got to go to City Hall to do this. They just wait to get caught. So I think that reality ought to be taken into consideration as you're doing it. Is there other effective ways to make enforcement and incentivize or both as you're doing it? But the Grannis folks in their document, I thought, captured it very well, that the most important thing to start is for the council and the mayor to have a clear objective of what they're trying to accomplish. You know, because there's lots of ways to do this, and some will put all the resources in one direction or another direction. But articulating what the objective is would make the job of coming up with what would work for the city much easier.
Yep, that's why I was wondering what we had, but because sometimes the residents can help you drive towards what it is, what you need by what kind of communication they're giving. So I agree, we need to have a focal point, which will make it. That's all I have. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Councilwoman Daniels, any questions?
So I guess we've been dealing with this for a long time, so I was expecting a little bit more precise information for the city, because this has been ongoing for a long time, and we do have to deal with it because it touches on affordable housing, it touches on quality of life, it touches on people being able to keep their homes if it becomes a revenue source for someone, let's say a senior who's low income and they can rent out their home and a room or something. So we do have an obligation to do it. I think there are a few big questions I have for, I don't know whoever is thinking about this, but the question of habitability, right? If someone is a tenant, they have a right to habitable housing. But if someone is doing short-term, right? The short-term covers everything from the guy who wants access to a backyard so they could see a star on a particular night, to the person who is homeless and wants a place to shower, to the person who is coming out of homelessness, don't have the savings for the first month, second month, or whatever, so they stay, so they can access maybe a short-term place until they can actually pay that first or second month thing. So it's a really wide spectrum of people who use short-term services. So how have you all thought about the concept of habitability? How do we say, well, yeah, it's okay to have a tent in the backyard for this, hobbyist astronomer where there's no potable water, no anything, just a tent, and you're just getting a license to be in a backyard. And the person who is transitioning from homelessness to housing. And then the reality is, right, that these systems are set up for leisure, right? And in the city, we only have, it's 2. I don't know if Strawbridge is technically in the city. We only have like 2 hotels. So how are we going to handle it? The leisure component of it as well, because someone who's traveling for leisure may not need the habitability standards of someone who's living in a place. So how have you all thought about that aspect of the
So I think there's a reality that has to come to this. Trying to regulate it all out of the box means we won't regulate anything. I think you have to focus on something. And I think the easiest to focus on is residential, and then sort of see how that works. Because there are all kinds of things that come into the short-term concept. I mean, they just do. I have seen hotels rooms now listed on Airbnb at some point, which I can't even figure that out. But you have to have a focus. If we try to do it all, every possible permutation of what people are actually renting, we will get nowhere. We will spin our wheels, try to write definitions that none of us are smart enough to write together. I mean, that's the reality of it, because no one else has written them well. So I think we got to focus on what we can do. And
So from our city's position, what is your thinking of regarding habitability? Like, are you suggesting that it be narrow enough that it's only short-term rentals that are going to become long-term, or short-term rentals for leisure?
yeah, you're in a place that I have never been in a discussion for in the years I've discussed this. Habitability is presumed. If it's a place that's rated, they're rated as habitable, not habitable, whatever. If it's not on what I would say the more prominent sites, Facebook Marketplace, for example, there's no standard.
I know, but
mean,
habitability is just a basic requirement in the landlord tenant law, right? So if we're regulating
Yeah,
the
this
stuff
is
that's
not-
outside of landlord
Right.
tenant
This is not, yeah,
protections.
they're not.
So that should have been
tenants.
an initial question. This shouldn't be a surprise. It should be, like, you should have some thoughts. We've been talking about this for years now, almost, as Councilman Major said, almost a decade. So you must have given some thought to, especially if we're going to start small, right? What are we going to, what's that small, and how, are we going to impose habitability requirements on them or not?
So I don't think there's anything that the city inspects, right? Where we start from a premise that we're not concerned the building is habitable. I mean, that doesn't require anything from short-term rental. If it's going to be a thing that we inspect, and I think the movement afoot is that it will be inspected by somebody, whether that's a fire inspector, whether that's a codes inspector, however this ordinance ends up. An inspector isn't there to say, well, this is pretty dangerous, but it's not a rental unit, so I'm going home. Habitability, I think, is just one of the presumptions that we would care about, because we don't go in and say people can stay in a building that is not habitable. I think codes spend a substantial amount of its resources closing and placarding places that people have sort of opened on the slide that are not habitable. And that as a policy is a problem as well, because the reality is there are people that needed to stay there. And when we send them out, we don't necessarily have a place to send them. They're not the owners of that building. They're trying to find a place to lay their head. And that's a bigger affordable housing issue that sort of goes with this. But the affordable housing issue and this are not the same issue. And this is not going to solve the affordable housing problem. It might help mitigate the loss of housing for residents and families in the city, depending how you do it, but it's not going to solve that problem.
So I would like you all to give thought to how you want to frame that in any kind of proposed legislation, because part of our ability to inspect property is kind of is somewhat tied to our needing to making sure that the housing that's out there is habitable. Which is, for those of you who don't know, that habitability is a requirement in our land structure in terms of the short-term rentals because they're so wide, right? And many of the folks who've been challenging our innkeeper statute and trying to get around our rules have been doing that precisely because to have a habitable unit requires more work. You have to make sure you have potable water, that the structure is safe, that there's safe egress and egress, that there's, if there's a fire that happens, that, that people can exit safely, which may not be the case if you're in a tent in someone's backyard, I don't know, experimenting with something. So I think we really do need to think about that component of this particular license. And I also would like us to not use the word rental. I know Lancaster uses the word rental, but if we're going to do anything, if the protections are going to be fewer than what a tenant would have, then we should probably shape it more as a licensee rather than as a renter, because that in and of itself creates a lot of confusions for people's and what they expect their obligations to be when they're either providing it or when they're purchasing it. So the habitability question was one of them. There's a second question. This one is just a comment. I would rather that we not hire a consulting firm to manage this stuff, because this is work that the licensing department can handle it well. And we've had experiences in the past where we contracted with a consultant and all they did was do the work, which was competent, but we could have done it in-house and then took the data of our residents with them so that they could expand their business elsewhere. So we have the capacity in-house. I think if we could just keep it in-house, I would prefer that. But that's just my comment on preference in terms of how it's managed, and not necessarily. I mean, people can choose if they prefer something else. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Green, do you have any questions?
Thank you, President Bowers. I have a couple of questions, not too many. Most of them have already been asked and answered. But I guess the first question I have is kind of more of a conceptual question. When looking at creating some legislation around short-term rentals, has anyone else put like caps in place? Like, so to make sure a certain neighborhood doesn't get saturated with short-term rentals, or that, certain neighborhoods might be more popular for people coming in for traveling and for vacation, short-term rentals. But then as we're looking at people who need it for more residential purposes, we want to make sure that certain neighborhoods aren't just being targeted and oversaturated for that. Is that something that other municipalities or other areas have looked into doing, like putting caps in certain locations?
Yes, Vice President Green. I know specifically the city of Easton in their ordinance said that no two short-term rentals could be within, I think it was 500 feet of each other. So really like trying to keep it so that neighborhoods aren't being oversaturated. And I can think of a couple places, even in our own city, if you go on Airbnb, there is a ton of them very, very close together. It was something that I recommended we look into. But I do know it's something that other cities are doing.
All right, thank you very much for that. And then just the other question that I had is for the administration. Do we have any precedent as far as short-term rentals in the city? Is this something that has been brought before the administration before and any other capacity?
I don't understand your question.
So I guess I'll make it a little more simple. I know last month or so before the Planning Commission, we had a gentleman come in interested in doing a short-term rental property in the house that he lives in. I believe that was the first one that we've seen as a Planning Commission. I didn't know if the administration has seen other people come before them or inquire about doing short-term rentals in the city, like registration or permitting process?
Yeah, so the one that the planning commission and zoning hearing board both reviewed this month was the first one that had formally come through process, and it was submitted under section 7-303.11B of the zoning code, which is a use not specifically prohibited. So again, it was kind of, without specific regulatory language in the zoning code, that clause in the zoning code is kind of a catch-all for when you have a kind of new or kind of use that's in the gray area. So that's why that was applied. But that was the first time we've had anybody come through the formal process for this use.
All right, thank you very much. That's all the questions that I have.
It's probably worth noting the zoning board voted that down, denied that application. And our office has been very, I think, consistent in the answer. We don't believe short-term rentals can be found in the zoning code. The zoning board cannot write legislation and create definitions that do not exist. This body does that. And so if you want to do it, it is on the administration and this body to come up with legislation to define it and put it into place. But the gentleman who was voted down, from my point of view, the vote means he can do it. Not that he can't do it. It's they couldn't find it in the zoning code to approve. But he still would need a building permit to put what he's trying to do in place, because it's not a prohibited use in the city. So if it is something that, and he has to meet all the requirements for a building code, he has to do all those things. It has to be something that's allowed to put in that property under the building code. But, again, these issues are going to keep coming. And, I do think there is a will between the mayor's office and the council to move forward with something that is functional. I do think everyone who's touched by it has to have their common sense put into this. So I think you have the right offices here. I think Mr. Ennerlein, Chief Ennerlein, would have some things to add to it. But there's a lot of considerations to be put into this. And we have to write it in a way that it's not something you just work around, like the boarding house problem. The boarding houses, it doesn't matter that they're not applying because they're running them. So we have to think through how to stop what you want to stop and how to allow what you want to allow. And that's real work for everybody.
Thank you. Are there any other additional questions from council members before we open the floor for public comment?
I just have one, maybe it's for all of us, but when and where do we start creating this legislation? Because I think it is something we need, but when do we start? How do we start? Is my biggest question.
Okay, before we review next steps, Councilman Majors?
Yeah, just one piece, and I think most of the folks from Granicus have, oh no, they're still here. I guess based upon what you've seen, and just the numbers that were provided by Ms. White regarding the rental units that are in the city and what an average annual fee would look like. Just looking at rough numbers, if we go somewhere in the middle, we're looking at between maybe $40,000 and $70,000 in fees based upon just the number of units that we had as unique rental units. Plus, if we're looking at somewhere, double to triple the average cost for a one-night rental as a fee. So if we're looking at something, $250, we're, maybe $70,000, $80,000. In terms of other communities, do you have any idea of what an initial outlay and cost is to get a program set up, and how many employees would be needed to do some of the from our perspective on codes, just to ensure that folks are properly inspected and the system gets up and running? You have to have IT backing, folks in tax, folks in building and housing, planning, et cetera. So just trying to see if you have any idea of what it costs to get a program or off the ground has been in other communities that you may have worked with?
Yeah, it can vary a lot depending on what the ask is. So we've worked with some communities that it's just everyone come in, fill out a form, pay your taxes. We're not really going to ask you a lot of questions. We're not really going to follow up on it. Other places are much more involved. I would say the inspections, some places just say we're going to bite the bullet this first year because that's going to be the year of the heavy lift where we have to inspect, nearly all of the current short-term rentals. But then year on year after that, there's only going to be so much turnover. So we just are going to have to budget for, maybe a half-time person, depending on, again, the kind of depth of the inspection. You have a lot of places that put that money on the homeowner to hire a certified inspector to do it. So we've seen a lot of different things there. We've also seen some places say, we're going to only, our budget is our budget, and we're going to have a half-time inspector, and we're going to say they're going to go and do 25% of all the short-term rentals just because that's the amount of time that they have, and we don't want to outlay any more money. And we know over 4 years we will get to everyone. I've also seen some places say we're only going to do 10% randomized inspections, and if 90% of those fail, well, that justifies us saying we need to hire a full-time inspector because we know that people are not being accurate. I will say also in regards to some of the other statements that people are talking about, I've seen some places use short-term rental inspections as a springboard to rental inspections, right? So using short-term rentals as a way to start looking at if inspections are going to be required for all rental property, and starting a sort of rental inspection program, of which short-term rentals are a piece of that. And so again, this could be a way to springboard into that, or to look at failure rates around things like, very basic safety or code violations, to say we have a real need to accelerate, and have full-time people making sure we're doing all the inspections, or to look and say, actually we have a couple problems, but in general, the places are well maintained and up to code. So we're going to reserve the right to do inspections, or we're going to let people self-certify. So it depends on both sort of how aggressive you want to be, I guess, at the beginning, but then also whether you want to use this as a way to get into sort of broader rental inspections for short and long-term housing. So I've seen some places, hire a couple initial inspectors to get over this first year, roughly of your size, but then plan to have fewer needs going forward, just because the number of short-term rentals that are changing year to year obviously are going to be a lot less than when you're going from unregulated to regulated.
Okay. Thank you. I know we have folks from the community that want to ask questions, so I don't want to belabor the point, but we'll have some follow-up, and hopefully we'll work with President Bowers on how we get a working group together to begin the process of putting some pen to paper.
Thank you. I just wanted to note in Mr. Humphrey's initial research memo, the city of Easton, their short-term regulated rental units, along with their rooming houses, are subject to inspection by their code enforcement office at least once per year. The other note that I wanted to make was in reference to the city of Erie. In 2019, a resident in a R1 designated residential zone was fined by the zoning hearing board for renting out her single-family house on Airbnb. The case was appealed all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, who ruled in her favor. This is important because it set precedent in Pennsylvania. Any municipality that has not explicitly outlined their position on short-term rentals cannot prohibit any rentals by the owners. I think that goes back to what you said, Solicitor Grover, in the case that was just before our zoning hearing board. So I just wanted to highlight those two things. Thank you, Mr. Humphrey, for sharing. At this time, we will open the floor for public comment. Just a few notes on our public comment. You'll have 2 minutes to share your comment. Mr. Truesdale will serve as our timekeeper. If you could please state your name and your address. If you don't feel comfortable sharing your address, please share the vicinity in which you live. And we will begin to my right. Is there anyone that would like to offer public comment? Okay, seeing and hearing no one, anyone in the middle section. Okay, if you wouldn't mind going to this microphone, this standing microphone, there should be a small gray button at the bottom just to make sure it's on. Okay.
My name is Rod Couts. I live in Shipo, 572 Ray Street. House was built prior to the Civil War. There's a one-person dwelling, one family. One of the challenges that I appreciate some of the phrases that you've used, holistic. I appreciate the map. I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. But one of the challenges you have here is Harrisburg is a very complicated city, and it's a very old city. If you want to imagine what an old city looks like, come to Shipo and look at a terracotta sewage pipe that has collapsed because of the number of units that feed into that pipe. It's there today. So if you have a chance tomorrow, walk down there and take a look at it. Most people don't even realize that our infrastructure dates back to the 1800s, in some cases earlier. The reason why I focus on infrastructure, it is key in terms of what you're talking about today. Because Shipo, for example, has 150 residences, 220 cars that are currently identified as attached to houses in that area. Most of the houses were built in 1892. Mine again was built in 1860. Community was never designed to be a multi-dwelling, densely populated community. Now, when you talk about one of the things that I thought was, so I guess my phrase here, you need to be strategic. You need to be a leader in terms of how you deal with this. Somebody mentioned that you were looking at Pennsylvania. Not really sure why you're just looking at Pennsylvania, because no offense, but Pennsylvania is not the model in terms of how you deal with short-term rentals or Airbnbs. Shipo in particular, 2 years ago, we had one Airbnb. Today we have 8. 4 of those are within doors of each other. So when you talk about looking at the challenges, so it starts, number one, you need to look at the inception when a realtor makes a decision, makes a sale, knowing that somebody's going to use that house as an Airbnb. It starts there. There needs to be some.
Thank you. Your 2 minutes is up then.
Can I continue on just for 1 minute?
President Bowers?
Yes, you can continue for 1 minute.
Okay, great. So it starts with the realtor when he knowingly sells a house that person's going to be an Airbnb. I don't know how many people have actually physically walked the map, but come to Shipo. One of the things you're going to find, Shipo isn't very big, and we have no parking. We have a restaurant there, which is great. We have an optical center. And one of the things you've got to physically walk where these Airbnbs are, because the challenge is, finally, one of the things, the challenge is you need to be strategic about what you're looking at. It's not one size fits all. And if you want to look at the model for how you manage an Airbnb, look to Europe, look to, and that sounds far-fetched, but they are much further ahead than we are. And there needs to be regulations, and you're losing income. And beyond the fact, the 220 cars that I mentioned, only 50% of those cars have parking permits, lost income. So you need to be strategic. You need to physically walk where these Airbnbs are. If you
Thank
don't,
you.
can't make a decision.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the middle section that would like to offer public comment? You're fine.
And
my memory is shot in the eggs, so it's a little difficult here. But you say, let's start this short and simple and not complicated like the governments and councils and all that. I would think a simple way to start it is to look at safety, which means fire alarms, directions on how to get out of the house, etc. In other words, I don't think you can stop. If you're going to open up B&Bs, you can't say, well, only so many can have it. Frankly, you got to be fair to everybody. So I think that however you do it, say you're trying to minimize the expense, but I would think you could start it very quickly by saying, okay, the owner has to report. I don't know if they have to or not. I don't know much about all this. But the owner must report that he's going to have. Okay, now, yes, that means you're going to have to do something and you're going to say it costs money. And the owner, then you all just have to know it's an owner that has safety systems, arrows how to get out, blah, blah, blah. And the thing I would do is I would put a rule in. This is just fundamental basic starters, that when he has this or she, the people, that person and owner must be there the whole time that this is going on to control it, okay? Preferably them. If not, say they're going away for a few days and you say, well, they can't do that. Then there should be someone, and then we get into how do you authorize people and all that. And then you get into probably all kinds of stupid expenses. But somebody, say you had who the owner picks to watch the house with these people do. I don't know why, and you want to start short and simple. I would think it could be to some extent along those lines. I think a lot of the other things you say you want to do, I agree.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else? Please come to the microphone. Thank you.
My name is Betty McLaughlin and I live in Shipo. I've heard from different residents in Shipo about short-term rentals that are there. There are noise problems, and Rod addressed the parking problems. I think that way to start is to look at the other cities' regulations like Easton or Santa Monica and look at those and see what would apply to Harrisburg. They don't have to be exactly the same, but what would apply to Harrisburg? Take the best out of them and use that. But the city is losing money, taxing. There are too many short-term rentals in Shipo for the area. That's plain. And I know that there's one that's very near my house where I think the owner of the house lives in New Jersey. And I don't know if there's anybody regulating. And it's a problem. In that house, there is an apartment. I talked to the apartment dweller and he said he's not sure how much longer he's going to stay there because all these people are coming in every weekend. You know, he doesn't know who they are. I wouldn't want people coming into my building every weekend. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the middle section? Okay, please come to the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Grant. I live at 1223 North 2nd Street, right in the heart of Midtown. And I am the unit that Jeff referenced earlier that just got rejected on Monday night. So you get a fresh perspective here. So just for some context, I did want to go through the process here with the city. We're looking to put an Airbnb on the 3rd floor that would be only used part-time as an Airbnb, also as an overflow hosting space and potentially different community engagement opportunities that we'd be able to use that space for as well. It would be a partially detached unit that would be easily able to be reverted. And there are a whole bunch of other things about it that would make it less of an impact on the city than a lot of other suggested ideas. And we would be the owner occupants in the bottom floors. I love the city. I'm not going to say anything about like what it is exactly that I'm trying to do here or why I'm great or anything like that. But I want to communicate that at least there is some small minority of people who are running these Airbnbs who have a different kind of MO and approach to what it is that they're doing. And if you need a representative to who, wants to see this done the right way, wants to see people welcomed into Harrisburg, I'd be happy to be a part of any sort of working group or anything like that. There are opportunities for tax revenue. There are opportunities for visitors to come into the city and support local businesses. There are ways to do this that minimize impact. There is the opportunity as the owner of the space to have that space in a more flexible capacity and use that for other opportunities. And I personally have a really strong passion for reversing so much of the disinvestment that's happened in the city. And that's something that I've already been dedicating a lot of time and energy into and want to continue doing over time. I would just ask for clarity and consistency. Like I said, I'd be happy to be a part of that process. I think there's a huge opportunity here. I'm excited about what could come out of this. But as someone who's hoping to use my space for this, I want to follow all the rules. I want to pay taxes on it even. It's an opportunity that I don't want to let go. If I might just real quickly add, really appreciate Mr. Grover and Mr. Knight. They've been tremendous to work with. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the middle section that would like to offer public comment? Okay, seeing and hearing no one. Anyone to my left? Seeing and hearing no one. Are there any final questions from my colleagues? Any final thoughts?
No, just to note, well, I guess, like I said earlier, I'll work with you and Cedric and departments and see if we can work on trying to put a working group together to start having conversation. I know if we're going to do something as we has been the tradition of this council as assembled, we would have more public meetings to get more input. We don't want this to be the only opportunity for public engagement on this topic. But I'll work with you, President Bowers, on figuring out how to do this, since I guess that some of it would have to come through building and housing.
Yes, thank you. So you got ahead of me. In
Oh,
terms of next steps, I know it was something Councilwoman Ross asked about. I know that I think it was really important for us to have this. Oh, Councilwoman Daniels?
Sorry,
It's okay.
I just have one comment. Something to consider doing as Chair of Building and Housing is speaking with the chief, because I know a lot of Airbnb folks sometimes will call the police
Yep.
to do
Yeah.
unlawful eviction.
Yeah. Yep. Been in touch with Chief Ederline. And Commissioner Carter. Okay.
Thank you for that. Public safety, as we've heard tonight, is a large component. Yes.
Just wanted to add one thing that may have been missed. Airbnbs fall under two areas of the code, building code. It's owner occupied, it falls under the residential code, which is a little less stringent. If it's not owner occupied, it's considered an R3 commercial. That may help clarify some.
And the law bureau just doesn't agree with that. This council, no council has ever debated short-term rentals in any ordinance was passed. It simply isn't there. You cannot read the words in that do not exist. So if that applied, the whole code applies and you need to do nothing. So the point is, and I'm going to tell you as the attorney for the city and as Supreme Court has said, doing nothing doesn't work. So we just simply do not read the code that way, because no council ever said, I am regulating Airbnbs. Here's my yes vote. So it just because it's a relatively new disruptive industry, just like Uber, it just wasn't there when these codes were passed. It wasn't even an idea to be had.
Thank you. Thank you both for your commentary. Okay, so in terms of Okay, thank you. Thought it was a fire alarm. Oh, great. Okay, so in terms of next steps, I think putting together a work group or a task force would be best. That way we can ensure that we have all of your perspectives as we begin drafting this legislation. Similar to the affordable housing legislative package, there was an affordable housing task force that was formed. Members of the previous administration and council members, along with the Law Bureau. We would like to add our research analysts into the conversation. So we can all come together collectively to ensure that we are drafting an ordinance that really meets the city's needs. I think commentary questioned or reminded us rather to be a leader in this space. And while we have looked at other third-class municipalities, we've looked at other cities as well. The national leader in my mind is Seattle, Washington. They're doing this very well. They've been doing it for years. It seems to be effective. And some of their measures, maybe perhaps we could scale for the city of Harrisburg. I also like the recommendation of using the best of each ordinance, and perhaps there are things in each of the ordinances within the third-class cities that have taken action that we could adapt for our city as well. Just one final thought, this definitely has to be a work in progress between council and the administration. I do believe that the mayor is open to some form of regulation. I think a major concern would be enforcement, and we talked about that here today. So as long as we have a clear enforcement piece within all of this and clear processes and procedures where we can effectively communicate with residents and neighbors that are impacted by these short-term rentals, I think that will be helpful moving forward. So next steps, please look to your emails. You will hear from us soon regarding the development of a work group on this particular issue.
Madam President, if I may, I would encourage you to have a very clear discussion with the mayor, because I don't believe the bureau directors are in a position to simply say, I will take that assignment on their own.
Okay.
I just think she directs the bureau directors and sets their priorities. So I will say she has told me it's a priority of hers to get affordable, get short-term rental legislation into the code. So
Yes.
she seems committed to that. And I would encourage you to meet to talk about the objective that the council and the mayor have together.
Sure.
Because that will help everybody else do their job.
Yes. She and I have briefly discussed this, but absolutely. I mean, we wouldn't move forward with anything without her knowledge or final approval on behalf of the directors. Okay, everyone. If there are no final thoughts, the time is 7:34 p.m. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. We stand adjourned.